Public Accountability Board, you're very welcome. I need to read out a little announcement because we're being filmed today. So this meeting is being filmed to broadcast on our website. The OPCC operates in accordance with the Data Protection Act. Data collected during the filming will be retained in accordance with the OPCC's published policy. Therefore, by entering the meeting room, you are consenting to being filmed and to the possible use of those images and sound recordings for publication on our website and or training purposes. I think we might get that printed on the packs, June, so that I don't necessarily have to read everything out every time in quite that way, just refer people to it. So if we turn to our agendas there, I think probably everybody knows everybody around the table except possibly for Kevin. Kevin, I'm not sure how many people you know. Kevin has recently joined us. So if we very quickly go around and say who we are for Kevin's benefit. So Alan Billings, Police and Crown Commissioner.
Welcome, Kevin. I'm Stephen Watson, Chief Constable.
Nigel Chiller, Director of Resources.
Carrie Goodwin, Head of Corporate Comms for the Police.
Michelle Butcher, Chief Exec and Solicitor to Alan.
Thank you very much indeed. We normally welcome members of the public and the media today. We only have one person, so Paul, you're very welcome. You represent the world. No pressure on you today. Apologies, we've had apologies from ACC Lauren Poultney, the Deputy Chief Mark Roberts, ACC David Hartley, Rob Winter. Carrie, I've got apologies from you. But you're
Sorry, my
here.
appointment changed. So.
Okay, right. Don't know, are there any other apologies? Sarah Slater. Okay, thank you very much. Announcements. Don't think I have any announcements. Anybody else with announcements? Public questions. There aren't any. Urgent items. There aren't any. Items to be considered in the absence of the public and the press. Item 17 on the agenda will be taken in closed session. 6, declarations of interest. Any declarations of interest? Minutes of the last meeting, which are on pages 1 to 8. We just got one addition to make, and that is one of the attendees was Michael Clements, who's not in the list as present, but he does speak miraculously later on, so we need to bring that into line. So the minutes, pages 1 to 8. Any alterations, queries, or can we accept those as a true and correct record of what took place? Thank you very much. On then to matters arising and actions from the minutes, pages 9 and 10. Michelle, are you?
Eric is going to take those.
Eric.
Just go through the actions. The ones that are marked out as complete, I'll not go through, Commissioner.
Okay.
So if we start with 289, what we're suggesting with 289 is that the new planning and efficiency group that meets for the first time at the beginning of April will take an active role in looking at monitoring savings plans moving forward, as well as the monthly budget monitoring reports that would normally come to this board. So what we're asking is that action get discharged from here, and it will be picked up through the planning and efficiency group, and any exceptions from that group will then come back into the Public Accountability Board.
Okay.
Moving further down, Action 295, this was around copies of award plans to be provided to the Commissioner as and when they were completed. We recognise that there's a large number of plans that will need to be completed, so we just wondered, Chief Constable, if you'd be in a position to give us a feel for how long it will take to get to the point where every ward does have a plan.
Yeah. Simple answer is no, in the sense of a definitive by X and Y date. I know that it's work in progress, led by the Deputy personally, and he's sort of pursuing this through his force performance meetings as well. So insofar as getting an end date on that, I'll feed that back in as soon as I...
What have I asked for? How many wards
It's
are
about
there?
90, I think.
Oh,
Yeah.
not too bad. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, there are broad ward profiles in sort of in existence already, and it's on the back of those ward profiles, together with other
Yeah.
local plans and what have you, that these things will emerge.
Okay.
But it's good to have them there in the office if we're doing visits or
Yeah,
whatever.
absolutely.
I had an email from Mark on that one, and he said the NAP to show you where this sits on where the local profiles and everything sit on the intranet, so
Mhm.
that you can have instant access to them.
As
And
they're
that
getting
can-
developed.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
then that action
Yeah.
can be discharged.
Okay.
Good.
Okay.
I mean, it isn't, just to reassure you, Commissioner, it isn't, this doesn't fall into the realms of a lot of extra work for people, in the sense that these profiles have been developed
Yeah.
precisely to allow us then, with neighbourhood inspectors predominantly and local authority partners, to be able to say, well, if this is then the grist to your daily mill, what is it that you're doing with
Yeah.
it, and how are you affecting things?
No, I think it's simply, if I'm going to, if it's a committee meeting, then it's good to have
Yes,
those.
yep, absolutely.
Yep, okay.
Okay. The next one there is Action 296. DCC Roberts agreed at the last meeting that he would come to a future meeting around the implementation of smart contact, and it was just to check with the chief whether April would be too soon for that. Maybe May might be more appropriate.
Yeah, probably. I would
Okay.
suggest, certainly the go-live date at this stage is going to be the 22nd of May, so
Okay.
it would be more appropriate.
I think we wait until we know
After.
it's live, and then we
Okay.
decide
So
which
yeah.
which meeting
Yeah,
it is to
okay.
do it that way.
The next one is with regards to Operation Signature and the provision of a report to a future meeting on the effectiveness of that. And it was just to get a feel from yourselves how long you feel you need to be able to evaluate and then come back.
So I think probably two bits. One, that actually should probably be to me, because it's firmly in my portfolio. I would say July probably the appropriate time to effectiveness. It's been about 6 months by then.
Okay, thank you.
This is about fraud, isn't
Yes,
it?
it
That's-
is.
yeah. So July.
Okay. Action 298 was around the force management statement and how that relates to the police and crime plan and the forces plan on a page. And we had an overview report at the last Public Accountability Board, but I think we all recognise that there was some further work to do to create that connectivity. And I wonder if the Planning and Efficiency Group might be a good place to start to have that conversation.
Yeah, I think that's a good suggestion. It's a really important piece of work, of course, and tracking the progress through the first iteration at least will be something that probably requires an element of dialogue in the design of
Sure.
the work as well. So it's probably a good forum to do that.
Okay.
Okay.
And the last one is Action 299, and that's a copy of the generic victim booklet to be provided to the Commissioner.
That's what I was going to talk about in terms of my paper and CVC.
Okay.
Okay, thank you very much. I
That's
think
it,
that
thanks.
concludes everything under item 8 then. So item 9, which is the PAB work programme, pages 11 to 14, and Michelle, I think you are...
Yeah. So at item 9, Commissioner, you'll see a work programme that goes forward by 3 months. We have shared with Force colleagues a 12-month work programme. You can appreciate that as we go through each 3 months, the dates are firmer and they get firmed up, and some things that are a bit more flexible might go in as additional items that are topical to whatever we're dealing with. But what we've done is organise the work programme under headings so that Force colleagues can see what report is contributing to which of your statutory responsibilities. So, for instance, there is a section on strategic and financial planning towards next year, one in relation to tracking progress against your police and crime plan currently in the year, etc., etc. For the first time, we are going to present a quarterly report that will bring together performance feeds from Force information, from your office and from partner information to show whether we're on track with delivering the outcomes in the police and crime plan generally across the piece. That quarterly report will of course be built from a Forces perspective on the monthly performance reports that are put forward. We've discussed this with DCC Roberts. And will also be underpinned by a financial report. So where Erica explained earlier that budget monitoring reports on a monthly basis won't now come here, they'll go to the new planning and efficiency group. They will make up a quarterly report that will underpin the quarterly performance report, so you can see whether the plan achievement is on track and what a resource is looking like underneath it in terms of monitoring the resources to deliver the plan on a quarterly basis. For the first time, we'll also have inputs from the districts, the 4 districts, with Barnsley, Doncaster, Rotherham and Sheffield commanders coming to PAB to talk to you about local issues on a district level for the first time, which again we've discussed with DCC Roberts. So there won't be any surprises here for the force, and we'll firm the 3 months ahead at the next month's PAB, and we'll do that on a rolling programme.
Okay, any questions about that or comments? All seems sensible and okay. I should point out there's some bits of hot cross bun, seasonal food, on the table. Do help yourselves if you would like to do that. Pass it along to others.
A big cold cross bun now.
We move now into that section headed PCC Strategic and Financial Planning. Item 10 is the Forces proposed delivery plan for the refreshed police and crime plan outcomes. So, Chief, this is over to you.
Yeah, it's a very short paper. It simply sets out how we propose to respond to the refreshed police and crime plan and to give voice to those specific objectives that sit within the plan of the PCC. Suffice to say, without necessarily going through the report line by line, the amendments to the PCP have been fully considered by the force, very much baked into the plan on the page and the force's performance management framework. You'll see some outline detail in the report around the sort of the December sort of refresh, where we had a very structured approach to doing this in the sense of senior participation, where we were looking at strengths and opportunities going forward, as well as sort of weaknesses and threats in terms of that which might mitigate against us delivering the full panoply of objectives within the PCP. The relevance of the performance management framework is really important, because whereas the plan on the page, if you like, captures in more sort of outcome type terms what it is we're about, and that therefore is less susceptible to change year on year. It is the performance management framework that sits beneath that, which is critically important. It is the PMF, if you like, that drives the business of the force. It finds most topical expression at the force's sort of monthly performance day, chaired by the DCC, and then that cascades down into all of the chief officers' individual portfolio sort of management meetings. So the PMF very much describes what is expected from whom and to what standard, and it gives the relevance of those particular points of performance focus, linking it back up to the strategic outcomes that are required in your plan. In a nutshell, I think the review and the sort of resulting sort of change to the PMF leaves us pretty confident that we will be able to deliver on all aspects of the plan. And of course, there are many aspects of the plan that have already, I think, been demonstrated to have been reflected in improved force performance. And I cite, of course, for the first, but I can't guarantee for the last time during the course of this meeting, HMIC's effectiveness report and the finding of good, which does speak to many of those practical things that have been put in place to address those broader issues that fall out of the police and crime plan.
It's the force's view then that what you have in the police and crime in the plan on the page,
yes,
exactly reflects the priorities of the police and crime plan.
It is.
And you don't have to adjust your plan on a page in any way, because they're broadly in line, or
they
something along those.
Exactly right. I mean, the plan on the page absolutely starts out from the three core outcomes, if you like, draw precisely from those which are described within the police and crime plan, and then cascading down from that in terms of things that we have to be good at to consistently deliver those things, how we manage and align our resources. They are all designed to be supportive of delivering those outcomes. The thing that, as I've expressed, that is most susceptible to almost tactical change quarter on quarter, year on year, really is the way that the performance management framework adjusts, because there are nuances around prioritisation, elements of focus, and issues then of broad recruitment, training, and what have you, that brings about the sort of effect that we try to achieve.
How do we report in to see the way in which police and crime planning is being supported by regional collaboration with Humberside? Have you any thoughts around that?
Yes, well, it's a key part of the plan on the page. The issue of working with others, working with partners, there is a very specific element to that, and again within the performance framework, where we have in all of our collaborative agreements, where we have designed specific outcome objectives, they are reflected in the force performance days. More broadly, where we're talking about efficiencies to be derived through collaboration, whether that reveals opportunity or money, that then comes into Nigel's world in terms of the broader management of resources, all of which finds very clear expression within the plan on the page, and then of course upwardly into our own various reporting mechanisms into OPCC.
Okay, thank you. Any other observations or questions, or happy with that? Thank you very much. That was item 10. So over the page, item 11, which is pages 19 to 22. This is the OPCC proposed delivery plan. Michelle?
Well, very similarly to what Steve has just outlined for the force, Erica in a cover report is outlining similar for the OPCC's contribution to delivery of police and crime plan outcomes. So I won't go through the cover report, which is self-explanatory, but explains how the office activity will cascade down into individual personal development performance development objectives. Then there's a fold-out diagram which shows the building blocks that underpin the 4 outcomes in the refreshed police and crime plan, and what you have put in bullet points in the police and crime plan underneath in orange, those sort of planks that you say aggregate up to each of the 4 outcomes. And then in blue at the bottom we show the building blocks of outputs that the OPCC are going to deliver over the 12 months to contribute to that. Now, I explained earlier, Commissioner, that what we'll do on a quarterly basis is pull our delivery against those outputs, the force's delivery against its outputs on the plan on the page, and any other partner contributions, and present a rounded picture of whether the plan is on track or not.
Thank you very much indeed, and thank you to those in the office who have contributed towards this, because I know a lot of work has gone into this and to getting it right. Anybody else want to comment or question or observe on it? Or
No, I think it's very clear. It's laid out in a way that just makes it very accessible and gives that broader picture. So
it's our plan on the page.
It is. It's catching on. It's catching on, which is good.
Thank you very much. So we move then to item 12, which is the Force Performance Report, Protecting Vulnerable People. Chief Constable, this is you, 23 to 28.
Yes. So essentially, this paper speaks specifically to those elements of the police and crime plan which relates to the priority of protecting vulnerable people. The ask, if you like, from yourself to the force really turns on issues of early intervention, tackling persistent offenders, prevention and action in respect of the sort of the high-risk crime types that are identified within the force's strategic intelligence assessment. This paper really points to 4 elements of vulnerability. Of course, there are more, and it is true to say that, in a sense, this paper really just highlights 4 categories. There are many more areas of vulnerability, and later in the meeting, Tim will specifically talk to issues of CSE, which self-evidently is a massive issue. So, whereas Tim will talk to that, it isn't referenced in this particular paper. It is in subsequent papers. This talks about rape and serious sexual offences, missing from homes, hate crime and domestic abuse. The paper just points out, for purposes of clarity, the definition of vulnerability, and I think it always helps sometimes just to restate what vulnerability is actually, because it is a phrase that's commonly used. It's commonly used in all manner of public discourse these days, but sometimes I think it's used in a sense that people don't fully grasp in terms of what we're talking about, and the vulnerability definition is set within this paper. It is in line with the Police and Crime Plan, College of Policing definition and what have you. So a person vulnerable if, as a result of their situation or circumstances, they're unable to take care or protect themselves or others from harm or exploitation. It is a very broad definition, which by definition hardly shuts down the debate. It shows what a broad category this is. But it does, I think, point very purposefully to the notion that not everybody is vulnerable, but people can, from all walks of life and in all circumstances, be rendered vulnerable. And so the implication is that we both have to be good at spotting potential vulnerability, and having identified vulnerability, have bespoke mechanisms to mitigate the risk or harm of that vulnerability becoming manifest. If I just touch on those 4 broad categories and pick out what I think are some of the salient points. Rape and serious sexual offences. First element to pick out is the fact that some 53% of all offences are reported within 2 weeks. That is good insofar as it goes, but of course it points to the fact that nearly half of all of this very serious category of offence are not reported into the police in a very timely way. And as we all know, as reports take time to come in, you're constantly running the risk that there is an attrition. There's an attritional quality to how effective we are in bringing people to justice. So it does make the point that our work to encourage victims to come forward at a timely, early opportunity remains critically important. Notwithstanding the fact that we would like to see more people coming forward more quickly, you can nonetheless see with that something in the region of 1,279 active crime investigations at the moment. It is not an area where our specialist detectives are sort of moving around for want of work. You know, there is a lot of, unfortunately, there is a lot of this type of work that is coming in through the front end and is being dealt with. The issue around the sexual harm prevention orders that are referenced in the second paragraph there, I think, is important because it does actually talk to issues of prevention. I'll touch on this again when I mention domestic abuse. I think we are really stepping up our approach to being more engaged with those legislative instruments that we can effectively use to prevent people from committing or furthering their sort of offending in this regard. And similarly, I think it's worth pointing to the fact that despite the fact that we do not have full support for further action in all cases, many people, for a number of reasons, and a number of reasons which are fully understandable, many people will not support further police action, even having reported the issue to police. But in terms of those who do report, in terms of those who support further action, we are increasingly improving our performance, and you'll see that amongst our sort of peer group, which are predominantly metropolitan forces, we're now sort of performing the second highest level in our peer group. in terms of where a suspect is identified, we take positive action. Positive action is defined as whether people are charged, reported on, summoned or cautioned. So some positive getting a handle on these individuals. So I guess the point that I'd point to is, one, the importance of prevention is self-evident, but actually timely reports and then working with victims of crime particularly to give them the confidence and the courage and the support to sustain police activity.
Just if we pause just
Yes,
on that,
please do.
on that section. I mean, it is a cause of concern when people don't report and don't report in a timely way. I think some work is being done, isn't it, to try and understand that as to why that should
Yes,
be.
yes.
Is South Yorkshire out of line? Is this a general problem? It's a national problem.
It
so
is.
It's not simply a South
It is
Yorkshire.
absolutely a national issue, and our figures are not out of line with what is being seen elsewhere. And in many respects, actually, our figures are slightly better.
You have to set it in the context as well that far more people, this is a percentage, and far more people report historic offences than did a few years ago. So that skews the context of it somewhat. You can't go away from that. There's still people who don't report, but
Yes.
you know, it is a national picture.
It is. But so much of what, so whilst we're doing some further work to better understand what it is that prevents people from sustaining their support for prosecution or other intervention going forward, we do know from our experience, hence I think the real value of, there is reference further in these papers to that which we've done around SARC, opportunity for victims to be able to give evidence from outside of the court precincts, being able to do so in a way that gives confidence to people that previously hasn't been there. We know that the criminal justice system hasn't always been as gentle, frankly, and sensitive around very vulnerable people as it might have been. I think that's changed. I do think the wraparound care around victims and witnesses is very much better now than it has been. There are some emerging case studies, of course, as we actively intervene with the historic child sexual abuse type cases. There are some case studies of where you see victims have really led very troubled lives as a result of this type of offending, and it just points to the sort of almost hypercriticality of wrapping around these people the sort of care that hasn't always been available to them. So these are all initiatives, I think, that are designed to get to the nub of this issue.
Can I just touch on the SARC, just to reinforce what the Chief said? I mean, we are in a very strong position. If you're the victim of a serious sexual assault in South Yorkshire, you can go through the entire criminal justice process and never go near a police station, never go near a courtroom, and I don't know too many areas in the country that can say that. So not only is that a huge sign of the strength that we have in this area, but also where you have victims who make a report to the police and then subsequently can't go through with it. And there's a whole raft of reasons around that. It's not just necessarily about support, it's just about the will to see it through. If people pause and say, I can't go through with it, but then 12 months later change their mind because of the meticulous nature that we can start off those investigations and we can pick it up again. And that's a real strength of our approach now.
And that's partly about the capacity to store samples and evidence.
It starts with the SARC.
Yeah.
And if you can get a victim of serious sexual assault into the SARC, the level of care that they provide, the level of experience that the professionals and the staff have within the SARC, now means that we can get an investigation on to the very best start possible. And if subsequently someone says, I can't go through with it, all's not lost. If that changes in 12 months' time, 18 months' time, 2 years' time, we've got something that we can pick up and move along again with.
No, I think Hackenthorpe Lodge has been very successful, and we've had a lot of interest in it, and congratulations about it, including ministers that I've spoken with in in London around that. So I think that is a very significant place. And it's been good to see the judiciary in there as well, and also being supportive of it. We've got the video
Yes.
link now into the court,
Yes.
and we hope to see more of that, more use of that. And yeah, I think
Yes.
it's good.
I think it's a really important point. I think the judiciary have made at least as many strides as
Absolutely.
we in terms of the way that we collectively deal with these difficult cases, and I think the judiciary have performed magnificently actually in as we have in learning from where we've been in the past, and I'm certainly very encouraged with the support we'll get from the courts locally.
Thank you. Do go on. Domestic.
Okay, sort of domestic abuse. I mean, one of the themes that does drop out of domestic abuse, of course, is again the reluctance of people to support police action through to the end. And in domestic abuse, of course, the percentage of people who don't support police action through to a positive outcome is higher than in the sort of sexual offences category. So 53% of all people, so more than half of people don't support police action beyond a certain point. There are two elements at play here. I think the first is we are getting more reports, and of the reports that we are receiving, more of those are being converted into recorded incidents of domestic crime. So that conversion from reports received into a crime report appearing on our books is at an all-time high. So it had never been higher, and if you see the conversion rate, it ought to give confidence to the public that if you report, that we do take those reports seriously, and as a result of a crime being sort of enacted, there is a thorough investigation that will come on to that. Practically, we point to some things which on the face of it are fairly obvious, but these are nonetheless the things that we think are critically important in supporting more and more people to sustain their interaction with us in bringing about positive outcomes. Timely response is critical. Early access to safeguarding, victim support services, and then through fast tracking into specialist domestic abuse courts. If the process needs to be done swiftly, supportively, but being quick is really important in all of this. And similarly, the arrest of the suspect is important in that it just takes some of the heat out of an early situation. Practically and pragmatically, it is still the case that most domestic violence is perpetuated by males against females. It is very often the case that you will have a female, potentially a mother, who will report in fear an incident. The police will come, they will remove the suspect, the dust will settle, the safeguarding is put in place, and in the cold light of day you can see how pragmatically sometimes people start to say, well, actually this person, notwithstanding the fact that they are an abuser, is potentially a breadwinner. If this person is carted off to prison, are my children going to lose the roof over their heads? These are all very difficult considerations that people have to contend with. We are in a good position to help people, however. There are support mechanisms where these are not always the sort of binary consequences of doing the right thing. And particularly, and I know this is something that you actively commission and we very much support around the independent domestic violence sort of advisors. They are particularly important. They give confidence, they give access to support mechanisms for people. They demonstrate that there is actually a systemic support structure there that means that if you do the right thing for yourself and your family, that you're not going to be somehow left high and dry. And it is also important sometimes just to point out to people that, unfortunately, with domestic abuse, it is a case here that optimism and hope for a better future is always the enemy of experience, I'm afraid. I'm not here to cast sort of homespun philosophy, but it is true to say that in matters of domestic abuse, the notion that a leopard doesn't change its spots, it happens to be a truism. And very often people who are abusive they will continue to be abusive, and actually we do need to safeguard people from individuals in that regard, and there's much that we then do in and around the offenders, and that I think points to a very significant step up in terms of our use of domestic violence protection notices, and then through the courts in terms of domestic violence protection orders. Again, these are now at an all-time high. The use of these orders has increased exponentially over the last 12 months. And that, I think, is, again, really important, because these are legislative tools that impact those who are most likely to offend and offend again.
Can I ask about body-worn cameras? Because
Yes.
I know that that is something that, from an evidential point of view, would be very useful to have in
Yes.
domestic cases of domestic
Yep.
abuse. Does it also have any effect on the confidence of people supporting the police through actions, or is it?
To
Is
some
that
extent,
not
to some extent, it does, in the sense that one, there is some comfort to the victim of us being able to point to a source of evidence that very strongly corroborates what they've said. So the idea that it's one word versus another is not as acute. Secondly, even if people do decide not to support the police prosecution themselves actively, we can rely on that as a source of evidence to prosecute nonetheless. And that is something where the true effect, I think, of body-worn imagery comes to the fore. And practically, there is something very powerful in officers attending an incident of domestic abuse, being able to capture this on video. Again, the old adage about a picture painting 1,000 words is never more true than in these circumstances. With the best will in the world, you can author the most detailed statement that you possibly can. The impact of that in the cold light of a court hearing is just somehow lessened from the actuality. And we know from experience elsewhere, which is why we're very keen to introduce body-worn video into our organisation, hence the work we're doing at the moment to see how we might capitalise that as an initiative. But the experience that we've seen from elsewhere is that there have been occasions where the body-worn video evidence alone has been sufficient to bring upon the heads of perpetrators quite significant sanction from the courts, which just wouldn't otherwise have been achieved.
And how near are we, do you think, to introducing them into SYP?
Nigel, have we got a date? I know we're busy costing up working options as to practically how we might do
Yeah,
it.
Robert L's working on that with
Okay.
ACC David Hartley at the moment. The first phase is in the capital programme,
Yeah.
and certainly the firearms, I think, are being deployed in the next week or
Yeah.
so.
And firearms, I know, are first, aren't they?
Yeah.
So to speak,
Firearms are
but,
first, so the hope is that we roll this out beyond
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
It is a question of finance, timing,
Okay.
but it is very much.
So it's something we can come back to, and
Yeah.
yes,
Yeah.
I think we're well down the track in
Yeah.
terms of firearms.
So I think actually the Manchester situation was, what they did was roll out general body-worn video, but the kit, I think, and this was happening just as I left Great Manchester Police, the kit that they bought just simply wasn't suitable because it went on the body armour here. As soon as someone points a gun, they can't see beyond their arm.
Okay. So we can learn from others. Yeah,
We
try
can. I mean, I think pragmatically the prioritisation in part is some of the monies that pay for the body-worn kit for firearms officers comes from the firearms uplift pot, so there is a ready source of monies that we can draw upon. The rest we have to capitalise ourselves in constrained financial times, so we have to get to it. But it is absolutely an ambition that all cases, certainly of domestic abuse, we ought to be videoing those, and I also have an aspiration that we do so for all cases of stop and search interaction as well, which has a really good effect on complaints handling, de-escalate situations. People behave differently when it's being
And we've got your report, so still there. So thank you for that, and thank you for
Probably on
the.
a shelf, but
No, it should be on the shelf because you reach for these things as and when
Yeah,
you need
so
them,
we-
don't you? So.
So we
Well, it's on a shelf, not in a waste paper. Across the country, there are moves.
Yeah.
Linda, you've had a slight technical point, was it?
Chief, if you're happy, we'll amend the report to read with cases tried within 3 weeks of first hearing.
of first lifting.
Well, again, I think just in terms of context, I was only listening on Radio 4 this morning who was saying that the comments in relation to Northern Ireland where it takes about 580 days at an average case from start to finish.
580 days.
Yeah, 250 compared to 250 something in
Yes.
England and Wales.
Good grief.
So we said domestic abuse. Aside from that, it is a significantly different experience.
Goodness.
Okay.
Chief, missing person.
Okay, I'll push on. I'm conscious of time. Missing persons, I guess the just obvious point to point to is missing persons, because they're frequently drawn from those who are suffering mental health issues, children in the looked after system, and what have you. The people who are going missing are very often vulnerable, which is why it fits within this category. We do know from some work that we recently did that missing from homes just takes an inordinate amount of time for our people to deal with. And this therefore is a particular priority. We did determine that as much as 24% of all response officers' time was tied up with dealing with missing from homes, which points to what I hope is self-evident, that this is a nut that we absolutely have to crack, both in reducing vulnerability, but also pragmatically in creating opportunity amongst a very expensive resource. The good news is that there is a real focus now on particularly repeat individuals, repeat locations. Each of those is identified. The Deputy 3's Force Performance Group highlights those individual pockets of whether it be a person or a location, and dedicated problem-solving plans are in place for each of those locations. And again, this is one of the first tangible signs of where our neighbourhood policing function is properly starting to nut into what have previously been intractable problems that create some room so that we have a more rational sort of distribution of people between response and being proactive. And you can start to see, there's much work to be done, but you can start to see that there is quite a significant fall off in terms of some of those people. And so if you just talk to repeat individuals, from 30 odd individuals fewer than in October, that is a huge amount of work that is otherwise tied up with this. And so it's early days and there's much to be done, but we are seeing some very pleasing signs of reducing that workload, which is
very good.
Which is
And
good.
we've noted in here before that the number of children's homes that we have in particular
Yeah.
parts of South Yorkshire and the issues around missing children.
Absolutely.
Because clearly that's an area where you can't take risks if
No.
children go wandering off.
Exactly right, and we are seeing, with the increased focus on children's homes particularly, we're able better to distinguish between well-run children's homes and those that aren't. And of course, very often our own local authorities are not, it isn't that all children's homes are created by our own local authorities, so you can have an authority, as we have, from London, who will identify a property in Barnsley and they will house some very often quite difficult young people from Newham, for example. And we absolutely have to make sure that people are always running these establishments to a really good pitch. And some of the interventions we've had together with local authority partners, using the likes of Ofsted, to bring about the right result has made a tremendous difference. So it's good work, as we've seen with hospitals as well. Of course, A&E department's been a classic. So some really good work there. Hate crime, again, by definition, those who suffer hate crime fall very squarely within the category of vulnerability. Hate crime is generally reported to us in a more timely way than we see with some other categories of crime. The difficulty with hate crime to an extent is that in 41% of the offences that are reported to us, there's no identifiable suspect emerges. That isn't to say that we aren't looking for them. Of course, when we are able to identify suspects, then the level of positive outcomes is okay, but it does unfortunately still fall well below the peer force average. So it's not terrible, but it's just not great. It's not where we need to be. So there's quite a deal of work, I think, around improving those outcomes.
So we don't necessarily understand that at the moment, why that should be.
No, I think, no, we don't.
Is third-party reporting, does that work in South Yorkshire?
We have third-party reports, but it's very much minority of the total reports. Where hate crime can sometimes be difficult to detect is where, if you imagine that the majority of hate crime falls into the category of racial harassment, and the majority of racial harassment might be reported, for example, by people who are running a late-night refreshment house, which is a fancy way of describing a kebab shop. And this is the sort of the drunken yob at 3 o'clock in the morning, gets a bit anxious by having to wait in a queue. There's a bit of a fallout, and there's some verbal sort of utterance that's made that has a racial connotation to it. And then they leave the premises prior to police arrival. Quite rightly, those things are reported. But very often, of course, you've got an example of something that's definitely happened. The individual has made off. We'll try to identify them through CCTV, and we'll do the normal lines of inquiry. But very often, these are fleeting verbal interactions that are a bit of a one-off, and actually it's quite difficult to track. Where you have people physically assaulted, which is fortunately quite a rare event, but we have people physically assaulted, or particularly harassment that comes in the way of a written communication or what have you. Actually, our chances of success are much higher, and we do have many fruitful investigations where we've been able to bring people to book for this type of thing. Okay. So work to be done.
would be good, because I think there's a real difficulty explaining to the public,
Yeah,
and particularly certain sections of the public, that there is a difference between an incident and a crime, because they tend to think that all hate incidents ought to be or are crimes,
Yes.
and that's very hard
Yes,
to
absolutely.
get across.
There's a key message throughout all of this in that we want people to report, no matter how,
Yes.
I struggle to use the word innocuous, but
Mm.
however fleeting it may be,
Mm.
it's really important that we have the fullest possible
No,
picture.
accept.
And when you do that, when you encourage that, if someone's said something that's racist and has disappeared and the whole incident lasts 2 seconds, we want people to report that so we get a picture of what's actually
Yeah.
happening in our communities.
Absolutely.
Despite the fact the chances of us identifying that individual are extremely limited.
Yeah.
So you have to set
Correct.
your detection and outcome rate in that context. I'd far rather have a really high level of reporting and a much better picture of what's going on, and then we can target support those communities than a high detection. I'd like both, but there is a play-off between
And
the two.
I think that's a really important point, because one of the things that we don't reference when we talk about outcome rates around this is what we do in respect of the victims, regardless of whether we get a positive outcome or not. So if you take my example of somebody running a kebab shop, if they are repeatedly on the end of this type of incident, notwithstanding the fact that we may struggle to detect the individual scenario, if we identify them as a repeat victim, then there are things that we can do to wrap some sort of care around them. And in extremis, if it's a constant thing, we will place our own cameras and audio recording devices in their shops so as to capture the evidence of this sort of thing. Better to bring people to book should it happen again. There are ways that we can educate people as to how to deal with conflict. There are more routine, visible sort of patrols that we put in place. And of course, again, one of the key elements of the neighbourhood function is that you have bobbies who are known to these people, who can go and talk to them on a routine basis and give them comfort and support.
I know there's anxieties around, particularly in the Muslim community, around April the 3rd, and these letters that have been going out to individuals and mosques and so on. I know there'll be a high visibility presence around mosques to reassure, and a lot of work has been done already reassuring that community, and I'm meeting the Federation of Mosques, the Sheffield Federation, on Wednesday of this week, and we'll try and give more reassurance around that. But, and you're coming too, Tim? Yeah. Okay. Good, thank you.
Very briefly, the last 2 points I'd make, just in terms of item 4, future direction, we talk about the vulnerability assessment framework. The importance of that is that whilst we are delighted with the good that we get for effectiveness and the good overall, where we still require improvement around the dealing of vulnerable sort of people is not so much once we identify the vulnerability, what do we do with the vulnerable people? That has been found, I think, to be effective. But the difficulty is in managing call workloads, that there may be some hidden vulnerability within the mass of people who are in the queue waiting to be spoken to, or having been spoken to are somehow on the back burner. And this vulnerability assessment framework is designed to cater for that weakness in our current performance, so that we are quicker at identifying vulnerability and then allowing those things that have already been found to be effective to kick in. So that's what that relates to. And then final point is just around OPSEPTA. There's just there was some significant activity around knife crime, tackling knife crime and what have you. Why does it sit within broad vulnerability? Well, essentially, it's self-evident that the people who are very often victim to these offences are themselves vulnerable people, and there's just some
well, I did go out with an Operation SEPTA operation, and within 10 minutes they'd found a couple of knives secreted in part of Sheffield. So that was good to see that in operation. I also went to a round table which the Home Secretary called, Amber Rudd, quite recently, with those forces which had shown big increase or sharp increases in knife crime, which included South Yorkshire, West Yorkshire, the West Midlands. For some strange reason, Surrey was there. I wasn't quite sure what that was all about, but anyway, mainly it was the big conurbations. But we also had Cressida Dick, the Metropolitan Commissioner there, and Sadiq Khan, the Mayor of London. And it was obvious to me that it's very much a London problem, rather than, yes, we have had increase in knife crime here, but nothing like the capital, and trying to make the point to the Home Secretary that we shouldn't see everything through the lens, the prism of what goes on in London. So that in London, things like stop and search are a major issue with, well, you would know this, with community cohesion. Whereas here, we're having Bangladeshi mothers, Somali mums have been coming to me saying, we want stop and search, as long as it's done fairly, proportionately, because we think it is a deterrent, and we don't want our children, hurt by knife crime.
That's right.
But almost half the rise in knife crime seems to have been London-based rather than the rest of the country. So I presume they took that on board, but it was an interesting couple of hours round the table.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Are there any other comments or questions on that? Shall we move on then to where have we got to on the agenda? Oh dear, are we on to item 13, which is tree felling update. Perhaps I could say, first of all, that yesterday Sheffield City Council announced a pause in the tree felling programme. And I think we have to say that by and large, the improvement to the roads and the pavements has been much welcomed, I imagine, by police cars as much as anybody else. And it's nice to drive here now without dropping down a few potholes on the way. But we welcome the pause, and we hope that the City Council will use this time of reflection to think about the impact that this has had on police numbers and the way that can distort your priorities in the force. So we hope we're moving to a better place post the holidays, but the pause is very much to be welcomed. I've had more emails, we call them tree mails now in the office. I've had more emails about trees than any other topic. Serious crimes, CSE, the protests around trees has outdone them all, and it's just continuing. And that is a huge labour for me, because I try to answer them all individually, but when you're getting 100, 130, I think we had over 3 days at one point, that is a lot of answering that you're having to do. So it's a matter of sitting up late at night and trying to wait to get through those. So we welcome the pause for all sorts of reasons. But what's coming through in the emails, if I could ask you to respond to that, probably three things. One is the number of officers that are deployed on any given day. That is a cause of concern for people. I think secondly, why are people arrested and then nothing seems to happen beyond the arrest? So why is that happening? And the third area is one of impartiality. Are the police genuinely independent or impartial in their approach to the operation? What's happening here? So if you could say a word around that, Chief, that would be very useful.
If I just touch then on those three questions, and then Tim will give a broader update in terms of the sort of almost the operational sort of activity that's been undertaken. So there are three elements, and firstly, I echo your own observations around the pause. I think pause is good in the sense that it takes some of the heat out of the current situation. And I absolutely acknowledge the disquiet, for want of a better word, that has been generated in and around this, and I will talk in a while around this notion of impartiality as to where we stand on this. The numbers question, of course, in terms of the numbers that are deployed, these are individual judgments for the operational commanders on the ground. They will make a judgment on the basis of a wide variety of factors and considerations. And broadly speaking, they will select the numbers of people that they feel are required to achieve the operational effect of what it is that they're seeking to do. I absolutely recognise, however, the fact that people will take a view that these are straitened times, we've got lots of priorities, and the obvious question from people is, well, if things are so tough, how can you find 30 cops to deal with a small protest of well-meaning people? And of course, if it were the case that protests were always genuinely peaceful without risk, then of course we would be delighted, because we would frankly wish to police these events with a single officer or no officers at all. It is absolutely not in the force's interest to put expensive resources on the ground in the way that we've had to do. We have experimented. There have been occasions where we have sought not to commit the numbers of officers that have been necessary to preserve the sort of working areas of local authorities. On one occasion, we lasted a full 4 minutes before there was an incursion of the working area, which made the work impossible to continue. And so, unfortunately, there is an element of sometimes the numbers are required to keep a peaceful protest peaceful. If a protest is peaceful, it doesn't automatically imply that you don't need the numbers, because if you don't have the numbers, sometimes that in itself becomes the catalyst for the protest getting out of hand. So essentially, we are seeking to apply our numbers in a proportionate way. We genuinely try to put as few officers into these things as we possibly can, for the simple and obvious reason that the fewer officers we can commit, the better for all of us, because it is less costly, and we don't then lose the opportunity to use those officers in other areas. And I would be entirely candid in saying that, frankly, I wish that this were different and we could deploy our officers in different ways, but unfortunately we cannot pick and choose which elements of the law we have to uphold. The issue around arrests, I think, is an important one. What I will say is that we absolutely understand, and it is a source of regret to us, that we have within these protests an element of people who are of good character, who have been of good character, who are decent people, but through a very impassioned sense have found themselves coming into conflict with the law. We genuinely bend over backwards not to arrest people. There is a very structured approach to appealing to people, pointing to the consequences of not adhering to the process and what have you. We absolutely bend over backwards not to arrest people. We do not want to arrest people. We do not want to criminalise people. And my plea to people is, if you are being warned that you are liable to be arrested because your conduct is unlawful, then my advice would be, please be sensible and listen to the advice, because we don't want to arrest people. Where people have been arrested, however, some have been subject to charges, some have been subject to summons, some have been de-arrested, and I'll come on to describe what I mean by that. Some have received cautions, and in one case we have embarked on a process of restorative justice, which again I think is really important, because it gives the truth to our view that we're not interested in criminalising people here. And if we can, through reaching for some sort of restorative process, bring victims and perpetrators into a place where some sort of common arrangement can be achieved, then there's no need to embark on the criminal process, and that's what we've tried to do. This notion of de-arresting people, some people are arrested in the moment for causing a breach of the peace, which, as the name implies, is no more complex than your conduct is such in the moment to breach the Queen's peace. It becomes an offence. People who will not adhere to the warnings have been arrested. But at the point at which we remove them from the scene and we take them to a police station, the breach of the peace is over. And frankly, there is no chance of the breach of the peace in that moment being resurrected, because they have been removed from the scene. And in those circumstances, we will de-arrest people and let them go. Now, people may say, well, that sounds like a pointless exercise, but it really isn't, because the point at which people are creating a breach of the peace, it brings about the risk of others engaging in that sort of behaviour where public order offences or worse still assaults and the like are committed. So this is about sensible policing, taking the heat out of a situation, and sometimes where this is really where somebody has just become almost overexcited in the moment, it is an opportunity just to take the heat out of the situation, allow them to see sense, and then pack them off with a view to suggesting to them that they might think better of their conduct next time. So, in terms of impartiality, you know, I hope to have made it as clear as I possibly can that notwithstanding some of the criticism that has been implied, and I understand where it emerges from, that there's this almost sense that we are somehow working hand in glove with contractors and what have you. We really must assert the fact that ours is an entirely impartial professional approach to upholding the rule of law, and nothing more, nothing less. We are not the agents of, nor never will be, Sheffield City Council, AMI, protest groups or any of the other, but we do have a duty to interact faithfully and openly with all of the working parts of this particular issue, so as to be able to coordinate our activity effectively. We are absolutely impartial. We have, quite properly, I think, no view whatsoever that we would dream of expressing in terms of the rights, the wrongs, or anything of the sort. These are properly matters for public and political discourse. They're not matters for the police. We are simply there to ensure that we can balance off the rights of all parties, whether that be protesters, whether that be the contractors of the City Council, and of course the residents in these avenues, because it also has to be understood that the residents in these avenues are not necessarily synonymous with the protesters. These are different groups of people, and we have had examples of where some of the complaints about protesters have come from residents in the streets where the protests are occurring. So it is constantly about balancing off these things. We recognise, frankly, that we are something in between a rock and a hard place, because whilst all this is going on, all we can do is act impartially, professionally, with integrity, politely, within the law, but at the moment this isn't winning us any friends, and we understand that, and it is a source of regret. But alas, until such time as the broader dynamic changes, we are where we are, and we can only hope that as this pause becomes manifest, that perhaps it shakes out a different way of perhaps doing this.
Thank you for that. We've had many conversations privately, of course, about this ongoing situation. I will be meeting with representative of Sheffield City Council later this week to make some of those same points. But I thought it was important we gave you an opportunity to say all that here absolutely. At the Public Accountability Board. I also asked the Policing Protests panel, of course, with Andrew as chair of that, to go and observe, which you've done, and you're going to do a report back to me on Yeah, we have hit Purda now, that is true.
Okay.
Jeff, yeah.
So I was just going to suggest at this juncture, unless anybody has any questions about what I've just said, then Tim, you can perhaps just fill in some of the gaps with just a sort of a brief update in terms of the level of activity and what have you up to the point of the pause.
I'll just ask one question about restorative justice. I'm interested in that. So, not to take any specific instance, but if say you had residents who'd been upset by protesters doing something, making loud noises or whatever it might be, that might be an instance where you would use restorative justice as a way of bringing those the complainant and the
Yes.
and the protesters together.
And that,
so.
that would be a very good example where, in the moment, for one reason or another, it just hasn't been possible for one person's anxiety to register with another person's actions. The police have intervened, somebody has been arrested, but actually, in the circumstances, and particularly given the nature of the conduct, really the criminal justice process is not really appropriate to those circumstances, and common sense and just practical good policing implies that a restorative justice might be the better solution, and exactly as you described. In those circumstances, if you take the example of perhaps a hypothetical scenario of a resident having complained about a protester, actually having the protester and the resident do a sort of face-to-face where both recognise the implications of what has gone on one to the other, and sometimes it's no more than somebody recognising that perhaps their conduct has been such as to upset another, to issue an apology is accepted, and we move on. And that is sometimes the sort of outcome that is acceptable in
But of
these
course this
circumstances.
won't be known to the public. That's always
No.
going to be an issue.
Correct.
Tim.
Yeah, just I suppose just really to reiterate what the Chief says, we do recognise the sensitivity of this operation. Our role is to keep people safe, and it's to balance the rights of those who wish to protest with the rights of those who are affected by it. So we've had police deployments in 5 separate locations since the end of February: Thornset Road, Aberdale Park Rise, Kenwood Road, Sackville Road and Riverland Valley Road. And they're on days ranging from the 26th of February this year through to the 21st of March. We've got a dedicated silver commander who's running this constantly now, so they can keep track of what's happening on a day-by-day basis. We undertake a threat and risk assessment every day. In terms of numbers of officers deployed, 33 officers have been deployed on the ground, available to the commander on a day-by-day basis. Now, not all of those are being deployed at once. It is about graduated response. As the Chief said, on occasion on Tuesday the 20th of March, we withdrew all resources from the scene to allow work to continue and the process to continue. It lasted just shy of 5 minutes before work stopped again. So it remains a constant challenge for us. It has to be managed very carefully. We've got experienced commanders in charge of this on a day-by-day basis, and ACC Dave Hartley, who is the gold for trees, is undertaking an intrusive review of it on a regular basis. In terms of arrests or people reported on summons, there's been 25 people either arrested or reported on summons since the 28th of January of this year. And those offences range from everything from aggravated trespass through to assault, through to offences on the Public Order Act, criminal damage. As the Chief said, not all of those have resulted in prosecutions. We've undertaken restorative justice where we can. We recognise and reiterate it is a matter of regret that the overwhelming majority of people who have been arrested as part of this operation are of good character. But nonetheless, we have that difficult job of balancing the rights of those people who wish to protest with the rights of those who are affected by it. So that's the operational situation at the moment. There is a pause, as you quite rightly say. This is the resourcing of this. It is significant, but it is something where quite clearly, would we wish to deploy 33 officers on other things across the city? Of course, there's always a lost opportunity when you're deploying officers in this way. However, we have a difficult job to do here. We are absolutely impartial. It is about ensuring public safety, and we watch the situation carefully. If we have to deploy in the future, again, purely to maintain public safety and to balance those rights between those who wish to protest and those affected by the protest, we will have to do that in the future.
Okay, thank you. Well, we've given a good airing. Unless anybody has any other questions or observations, we'll leave it there and we'll watch this space. But hopefully, after the Easter holidays, we may be in a better position.
Yes.
We hope. So thank you. That was item 13. Item 14 then is a report on CSE activity, pages 29 and 30. Quite a short report. Is this Tim or is this?
It's you're right, Commissioner. It is a short report, and perhaps in some ways could have better reflected the findings of HMIC, particularly in relation to CSE, as the Chief alluded to. Whilst we are still found to require improvements in terms of the broader issue of vulnerability, in terms of the more specialist areas, and particularly in terms of CSE, HMIC have certainly been very cognizant of the significant progress that the force has made. As you're aware, we've got a CSE action plan that's been in place for a number of years. That's constantly reviewed and evolves as we move forward. In terms of where we've got to since the last time I reported on CSE to PAB, there are a number of actions that I want to highlight to you. Firstly, we've now got Connect implemented. We're shortly to implement Smart Contact. The issue of how we use those systems to identify CSE, to be able to flag CSE and then be able to feed that into our analysis is very important. That work has been undertaken now, and once Smart Contact is in place, that will provide us with a significant advantage in terms of how we do that. I'll give you an example. Our pre-existing systems, you could flag someone as a missing child, you could flag someone at risk of CSE, you couldn't flag them as both, which also presents obvious challenges. So that's in place now. Over the last month, we've launched our most recent CSE awareness campaign. I featured heavily on social media, particular focus on the dangers around online friendships and grooming online and sharing images. You'll see in the report that we did a video around a particular individual and took on board recommendations from young people as to how do we target the younger generation. There's significant progress being made around the implementation of crime review. You will be aware that we are shortly to significantly change the structures around how we undertake a whole range of investigative services, and our Protecting Vulnerable People portfolio is significantly affected by that. We will move from having separate adult and child safeguarding teams to having one single public protection team that's multi-skilled at a local district level. That's going to provide us with some significant advantages. One, it allows us flexibility of resource to be able to deal with demand at a local level. It allows us to forge much greater links with partners at a local level in order to bring to bear a partnership approach, particularly where some of these cases are very, very complex with very, very vulnerable victims. And it will allow us to have a more specialist workforce. We've got significant specialist training budgeted for in the transition costs around the crime review, so it will give us greater capacity, greater capability to deal with all matters pertaining to CSE in the future. Another significant development that I want to highlight to you is that we now include CSE at our OCG partnership board. So we could then examine and highlight the issue of CSE being a feature that manifests itself within certain organised crime groups. So it's discussed in that forum as well. We have a wide range of partners at that who wouldn't necessarily be alive to the issue as they would have been before. And then finally...
So that's a relatively new development then, that?
It is, yeah. It is, because there's certainly some evidence up and down the country that where you have organised crime groups that may well be involved in drugs, organised theft, other forms of criminality, that actually the network there is actually involved in CSE as well. So it's it's really important that we're aligned to that as we move forward. And then finally, it alludes to the continued recruitment of specialist civil investigators as part of our pilot working with Sheffield University. This is continuing at pace. We've now got fully fledged specialist investigators joining us. We're really impressed with the quality of applicant we've been able to attract to those roles. And I think it's probably just highlighting, I was only told about it yesterday. We've just got the results of the National Investigators exam that all trainee investigators, i.e. police officers who wish to become detective constables, or our police staff investigators take to qualify to PIP level 2. Highest score in the force came from one of our new civilian investigators, which was really pleasing. And they got something in the region of 86%, which is a really high mark for it is a tough exam.
About how many are there altogether, do you know?
Off the top of my head, the first intake was 18, there are intakes of 18 that come in at any one time. So we're really pleased because we've invested heavily, not just in the course, we've put an infrastructure in with a investigator development unit now within specialist crime services to make sure that they don't just come up to the course and then say, right, off you go. But we've got a graduated process where they're mentored through the actual assimilating to the workplace, and they undergo a system of accreditation before we then move them out to one of our public protection teams. We think that investment's not cheap. It's been at the expense of operational staff from across the force, but we think it's worth it because we've placed great stock this programme to increase our capacity and capability in this area, and it's important we get it right.
I'd be interested in meeting some of them just to see how that's worked out. It's an interesting development.
We can certainly arrange that, and it may well be worth you meeting Denise Booth, who's the detective inspector who runs that area of work, and she can talk you through the efforts that we've made and the process that we've gone through. In terms of work going forward, there's a couple of we've made some progress with that, but not enough, and the big challenges, because people flag things in different ways, and there's big challenges around data quality. So there's more work in hand to pick that up, and some of that is work that we will drive through the county-wide safeguarding board. There's a continued training of specialist investigators. As I said to you, we're going to move from having a fairly small child abuse team to having a much larger public protection investigation team. We're absolutely clear that will not lead to a dilution of specialist skills needed to investigate this type of crime. So we've invested heavily in what we call the SkyDeck course, but Specialist Child Abuse Investigation course, which is a specific qualification for detectives and investigators who investigate this type of crime. That will mean that we will have a significantly greater capacity of people qualified to deal with this, which is important because all our predictions, all our demand data in the crime review suggests to us that this area of business will continue to increase as people become more confident, as people see the results of some of the work that we've carried out for the last 12 months and will continue to do so. We hope that more people will come forward and report offences that have happened to them and have greater confidence in the police. So it's important that we work for that going forward.
But the recent trial which collapsed at Sheffield Crown Court will be a setback though to that.
It is. You have to recognise that these cases are complex, they're challenging, and some of them, like that one, we didn't get to a successful outcome. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't try. Part of the challenge of the past, if you want to get about 5, 10 years, we only prosecuted these cases where they were you could quite clearly see an outcome at the end of it. We're far more ambitious now with our partners in terms of the types of cases that go to court. We've developed a huge amount of expertise in terms of managing the vulnerabilities of victims, survivors and witnesses at court. But it's continually a learning learning process and want to pick that up.
And that was, of course, non-recent CSE, and they're always going to be more challenging. But I've certainly had victims, survivors, say to me, I'd sooner have the day in court, even if it was lost, because it gives a kind of closure to the thing. That, you know.
This force has learned an awful lot
Sure.
over the last few years. You're absolutely right. This is about people being, one, having confidence in us, being taken seriously right from the outset. Most importantly, it's about how do we work with partners to wrap the right level of support around victims who have sometimes the most complicated lives, often which has come about as a result of the abuse that they've suffered.
In your bullet points, you talk about a victims survivors group. Is that up and running, or is that an aspiration?
That's an aspiration moving forward, certainly over the next 6 months. I know, in the past we've done quite a bit around the experience of people who were identified as having suffered historic child sexual abuse. For me now, there's a bit about, well, what about the here and now? And it's about really understanding the victim's journey through the system, not just their experience with the police. It's about their journey through the system. We need to do more to continue to learn from that. And the reason I say that is this is a complex area of business. Any police force, any partnership that says, right, well, we've got that right now, will very quickly fail. We are a learning organisation, and we're very clear that despite the fact that we've been rated as good now by HMIC, our ambition stretches beyond that. Our aim is to be outstanding, and you only do that through a learning organisation, and that talks very much to that.
Tim, can I just come in at that point? You heard introduced at the beginning, Kevin. We've carried a couple of vacancies in the OPCC this year, Jamie and Oliver, who you took from us.
Doing a sterling job.
It's taken us a while to replace them, not necessarily like with like, but we've replaced those roles now to provide the Commissioner with assurance in areas the public and partners would expect. So on the one hand, yes, the Commissioner is heartened by the progress that's been made. On the other hand, the public and partners would expect not just to take things at face value, but to add in some evaluation and scrutiny in support of the Commissioner independently. And this is an area where Sally was working with force colleagues around the action plan and what had been done in relation to the consolidation of all the different action plan recommendations and ensuring those were but it's not, as you've rightly said, about ticking off points on an action plan. So Sally's now handing over to Kevin to have a look-see and work with force colleagues. And we were particularly interested, given the Commissioner's responsibilities for victim services, to be looking at that victims and survivors perspective.
Okay.
Do victims and survivors now feel the service that they receive from South Yorkshire Police is a good one, and future to be outstanding one? I know, as you've said, other forces look to South Yorkshire now and the College of Policing in terms of good practice in this area, because it's been a road that we've been first to go down. We've got Telford now and Oxford, who are following the route that you've taken.
But I think the in some ways you can be very harsh with yourselves, can't you? We want victim and survivors groups, we can keep learning. I think the day that we get to a stage where a victim and survivors group says you're good now, we say, right, that's fine, we've got a good standard of service. It won't take long for it to fail again, because I can't stress how, from particularly some of the conversations we've had with Stovewood, I can't stress how difficult and complex these cases are. Victims and survivors of child sexual exploitation often have the most complex vulnerabilities anyone could ever encounter. I don't say this lightly. I've been a police officer for 22 years. I've worked all over the place. I've seen all sorts. When I look at some of the stories behind some of the victims and survivors of CSE in this county, it is beyond tragic. And to bring some sense of justice to an individual who has got such complex needs, you just cannot hope to get it right. There is no formula that you can pick up and say, that victim's got that issue, therefore here's the solution. Therefore, even when you think you've got it right, the process of being able to go back and actually have a conversation with that victim and say, well, how was it for you? How could we have done better? In some ways, irrespective of the justice outcome at courts, you know, even where we get someone convicted as we have done, and they get 10, 20 years in prison, even when that's happened, how can you make it better the next time? That's how outstanding force operates, and that's where we want to get to.
I think one of the things we've discovered, I often say it, is that our understanding of who the victims are, the primary victim is the groomed and abused person. But there are often families around them, siblings, younger daughters, that sort of thing, younger sisters, and then ultimately children, of course, from this. But also eventually in those ripples of people who are affected by it are police officers who are having to deal with this, and social workers and that day in, day out. And I think we need to sort of be sensitive to all those further victims of the initial grooming and abuse. But, I interrupted you somewhere in there, but you may have completed
well,
all the things you wanted to say.
There's a couple of other bits to pick up, really. I've talked about training, talked about victim survivors group. Intelligence sharing of management. We've done an awful lot with, I think, what I'd call the obvious partners in terms of training, development, education, social workers. We've done huge amounts, but again, the issue with CSE is it's so often, and even today, a hidden crime. So environmental cleansing workers who are working in parks, in right across the congregation, how alive are they to the signs, and what reporting mechanisms do they have? So I just think that's just one example, but I do think there's more to do to completely rethink is how you develop your eyes and ears on the ground to spot the signs of this, because it can often be the snippets of intelligence that starts a journey that uncovers something really significant, and I do think there's more work to do in relation to that moving forward. And that's all I've really
Thank you very much. Well, thank you for the report. Perhaps I could make a general comment. I know this is not a criticism of yourself, because I know you don't write the report, but I don't know whether you can pass this on to the report writers, because I noticed it in one or two of the reports that we've had. And particularly this one is very much internally focused, yes. I think. Whereas I think if report writers can understand that they're reporting to me, but through me to the public, so it's the public in a sense that they need to have in mind. And therefore, we have to be careful about the jargon we use and the way we talk about. There's a reference here to Kayleigh's story. I haven't a clue what Kayleigh's story is. I don't suppose the public have. It's that sort of thing. If you can just be aware that it's the public through the PCC that these reports are being written, I think that would be very helpful, useful. Thank you very much indeed. I think we've said everything we want to say there. Thank you for that. So we move to item 15, which is Victim Care Strategy Progress Report, pages 31 to 34. Chief, this is yourself.
Tim, you're doing this as well, okay. And this one won't take too long, I don't think. It's just to highlight progress, isn't it?
So, I suppose from a personal perspective, as ACC crime, my starting point is that providing the right level of service to victims of crime is absolutely, it goes to the heart of what we are as an organisation, and we recognise that where the force stands at the moment in terms of the commonly recognised measures used by forces across the country, that there are forces elsewhere in the country that do this at a significantly higher level than we do, and they do it at the level that we aspire to. Last year we launched Complete Victim Care as a new strategy. You are aware that last year we had a number of new superintendents join us, and Superintendent Steve Chapman, who came from Durham Constabulary, leads on this for the force, and much of the implementation of this mirrors and his experience and learning from his time in Durham Constabulary, as I'm sure the Chief will testify to. In June 2017, our satisfaction data confirmed about 78% of victims were thoroughly or completely satisfied with the service that they received, and that puts us about midway, 22 out of 42 forces in the UK. Northumbria and Durham consistently achieve results in excess of 88%, which puts them in the top 5, which is where we want to be. Superintendent Chapman did a significant amount of work trying to establish what the views of the people who were actually delivering the service, what was the issue. So overlaying what the feedback from our victim surveys told us, what some of the narrative told us about victim services, conversations he actually had with victims of crime who'd expressed dissatisfaction with the service, and actually correlating that with the officers and staff who are charged with delivering the service. 3 critical issues were identified. One, officers just feeling that this fell down because of resources, time that they had available to spend time with victims, the time that they had available to update people. It's a question of priorities. Second one, that we had an out-of-date victim crime booklet that was not being used effectively, and thirdly, that there was no overarching forum, no working group across the force that was actually dealing with this issue, coming up with solutions and delivering them on behalf of the force. So in September 2017 we launched Complete Victim Care. This is absolutely central to delivering a victim-led service throughout the force. There's a strategic meeting that occurs monthly that's chaired by Superintendent Chapman. In terms of progress, I do that at the Chief Officer level through the Crime and Criminal Justice Standards Board. A number of things that we've put in place, I'll just touch on them. A significant internal communication plan that we got a victim of crime to actually help us with, a lady called Tahira, who had been the victim of harassment, antisocial behaviour, really quite distressing story. The service she'd had from us wasn't what I would expect, the Chief would expect, a member of the public would expect. She had raised this with us. We had then taken significant steps to put that right. And following a number of discussions with her, she agreed to tell her story personally, so we could use that to highlight to officers the impact when we get this wrong. So that went out in September. We've now got customer service, single point of contact and champions on each district who are driving this locally. We now have a new victim of crime brochure. If I just pass one across to you.
Thank you.
In essence, there's a number of different sections in this one. There's a number of different sections in this. First and absolutely most importantly, it has the details of the officer who is dealing with the case and how contact can be made with that officer. It then talks through what will happen next. It talks through different levels of service if you're a vulnerable victim. It then talks to the criminal justice process to give people information about what might happen and different options that can happen. It talks about the victim's personal statement. It talks about right to review. It then goes on to support organisations and signposts people to a whole range of different support organisations. And then at the end, it talks to crime prevention about how people can help themselves to prevent them becoming a victim of crime again. This goes out now and is used regularly by all officers. We've since, it's been out 6 months now, we're now undertaking a review now by speaking to victims of crime to find out how useful it is. So it is under review again at the moment, but it is far more up to date. It talks to the relevant points that we want to get across to victims of crime, and it's now in regular use across the force. So there's that. What we've tried to do with Complete Victim Care is just keep it as simple as possible. So there's 3 key points. First one is about when officers are allocated a crime, they contact the victim as soon as possible, introduce themselves. Secondly, they agree with the victim when and how they're going to be updated. And then thirdly, they get one of these. They're the 3 things that make the biggest difference. the three things that we weren't consistently getting right. We're now starting to do that. We're starting to get some traction on that. But we have to monitor it going forward to see what, to evaluate what the overall impact is. We've rolled out more training for around restorative justice, which is rolling out in districts now, because we recognise that often where there's a restorative justice outcome in appropriate cases, that brings far greater quality and satisfaction to the victim. And as I say, there's a completely improved focus on victim care, and that's right through to the screens on the computers now coming up. One of the big things that we've made of is that victims have names, they're not just a crime number. So it's in the face and the consciousness of officers right throughout our IT systems, right throughout the stations now, and is actively promoted on briefings.
Okay.
We've started to see a slight uplift based on 12-month data. It's now at 79%. And you can see some of the issues behind that. The other things that we are starting to monitor though are, and in particular, the number of calls that come to Atlas about, can you update me about this? Because what we want to see in the long term is a downward trend of that. Calls into Atlas, particularly on the one-on-one service, the challenge that provides, also for us in terms of capacity, is well documented. A significant chunk of that is people ringing up to say what's happening with my crime. We want to see that decline over time. And again, we're monitoring actively the number of complaints we get about service standards through professional standards. And again, we want to see that decline over time. So in terms of future work going forward, there are 4 different points on there. One is about how we're actually going to survey satisfaction in the future. The mandatory requirements that existed for years, where we survey victims around vehicle crime, around burglary, around violence, have changed now. The only mandatory requirement was service satisfaction. We need to do some thinking about, well, what is it that we want to survey in the future, and how do we maybe think about how we want to change that, but make sure that we've still got some synergy so we can judge performance all the time. A big issue for us is about getting victim support access to Connect. So we're just implementing that. That is a challenge at the moment, but even with Connect Broad. I think there's more to do over the course of the next 6 months, particularly as we start to have inspectors, sergeants, promotion processes as we move forward, making sure that victim care principles feature throughout those promotion processes to absolutely nail down the fact that this is core to the purpose of the force, and then to continue to recognise excellent care as part of our rewards and recognition process going forward. So that's the update in relation to CBT. Happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, can I say we welcome the report and the progress that's been made here, and I particularly welcome what you were saying about complete victim care and those 3 principles of operation. That seems to be absolutely spot on. And I think it'd be good for us to have a further report later in the year to sort of bring us up to speed with how this has gone, because obviously victim services is of particular interest to myself and this particular role. And I think that one of the areas I'd be interested in is victim satisfaction is measured here quite early on in the victim's journey. I think we need to get some sense of what happens to that satisfaction rate as the journey continues. So if that could be part of any ongoing reporting, but otherwise I think it's all good stuff. Any observations?
Just a couple of things. Tim, there's clear links to the baseline survey and what the baseline survey on confidence talked about in terms of victim follow-up, which I know you're alive to, as Dave Hartley is chairing the Trust and Confidence group. And I think, just in relation to fraud, victims of fraud, can't see it jumping out of the leaflet, but we're going to be working as an office this year in relation to those victims of fraud and signposting to services and who owns the victim care, given that a lot of that crime is reported to national agencies. And then finally, Police and Crime Panel, we met with them yesterday in terms of agenda setting. Just a heads up that they've asked for data information from the force in relation to the impact on victim satisfaction of the use of handheld devices by officers. So reporting things in homes, etc., and what's visible to those victims in the use of handheld devices. I'll give you the heads up now because the report I think they want is it by the 12th of April. So just look to Ali as well.
They're a very busy and energetic police and crime panel, the current lot, and they're going to a lot of conferences, and they're I mean, quite right. They're bringing things to the fore. So we'll try and tell you, so you can tell us, so we can tell them.
Indeed. Just to touch on fraud, I think probably in terms of fraud, when we have done a operation signature, that will give you a far greater appreciation of the work that we put into that. It's relatively new. We only really got into operation signature probably last September, so we're still trying to roll it out. But the work that we're doing around identifying vulnerable victims of fraud on the back of the data capture that we get from actual fraud, and how we then overlaying that with some of the mosaic data, because it's very easy with fraud to pick out demographics, people who are more likely to be affected, and then if you overlay that in your mosaic data, you can then pick out areas that need to be targeted for crime prevention, and then that can become part of your neighbourhood problem solving on top of antisocial behaviour. So all that is in hand, and I think by the time we get to report to Pam in July around signature, I think we'll have quite a good story to tell you on that.
Good.
Tim.
Thank you very much indeed. So on in our agenda to item 16, PCC decisions report. Don't think this need detain us very long at all. There they are.
There's just one amendment to make, Commissioner. Yes, the decisions speak for themselves. The final item around the Orgreave archive, the decision was made by you in principle on the 23rd of February, so that date should appear as the date that you made the decision. It's that the paperwork caught up by the 16th of March, but you were anxious to secure the services of the current archivist to continue his work. And that's why you signalled to the force at an earlier date that you'd approved it.
Okay, I think that's the whole of the agenda insofar as we're a public meeting, so we have to ask Paul sadly to leave us. Do have a hot cross bun if you'd like on your way out.
I'll say thanks, but no thanks. but there we are. I'll see you next time.
Wish you a happy Easter.
You too. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay.